I think Josh is taking care of the
What are
recording.
what's the other book?
And
Maybe
without further ado, Haba, it's all you.
Okay. Well, it's lovely to see everybody this evening. And Chag Urim Sameach, a happy festival of lights, as one of our Second Temple period people called it, photos in Greek, Josephus, called it Festival of Lights. And I am looking at your beautiful rainbow Chanukiah and thinking of all the lights and the spectrum of lights there. So this evening, I'm going to, at a couple of points, I'm going to try and put us into some breakout rooms that people can actually discuss among themselves in small ways. And Josh, I'm going to ask you to actually handle that, and I'll tell you when. But looking at the numbers, I think 3 breakout rooms will be great. Okay.
No problem.
And I'm going to share this. And let's see, that's not sharing yet there. Did it share?
Yes.
Bingo, now it's there. So this is our Back to the Basics class, and we're looking at the books that didn't make it and the oral book that did. Before we do anything else, I wanted to point out that there is one link now that all you need to do is this particular link for Safaria, and if you click on the correct page, it will link you to the correct page. So this is the only page you need, and you can bookmark this one particular page on Safaria, and I've sent that to Josh, and I'm sure he's going to share that or has shared that, but you want number 2 for today. I also included some ongoing resources there, and those are sources that I want you to be able to use on a regular basis. So I'm actually going to show those to you. I showed you briefly last time, but this one is the Jewish History Timeline, and it's a really useful tool, and I've optimized it for this particular class. So if you scroll down, you'll see that there's a link from Genesis, that is from Genesis to Sidur Lev Shalem, and that will select the particular things that I think you need to know, or which I'm referring to in this course. And what's really cool about this useful tool is not only can you scroll back and forth, you can click on everything and you want to find out about the Hellenistic period, so you click on it and it tells you about the Hellenistic period. But if you don't like timelines and you like things in a table, you can just put it in a table like this and read it that way. Or you can look at it geographically, which kind of at this point gets it a little crowded because most everything that's happened has happened in the land of Israel. But we're going to be moving past the land of Israel, and you'll be able to see things in other places as well. And the other tool that I want to share with you is the genre map of rabbinic literature. And this is a tool that I designed a long time ago, but it works really, really well. And it explains the relationship between different documents. So here is the Torah Shebichtav, and you'll note that I have it set up so that the lines here are horizontal, representing the 5 different books in the Torah. And here are the prophets and the writings, also horizontal. And over here is the Mishnah, which is the final book that we're going to be looking at today, the Mishnah and the Tosefta. And you'll see that they are oriented this way, like the Talmud is. And in between, we see this area called Halakha. And in the period when Halakha developed, between the time of the Torah and the time of the Mishnah, some of those halachot were preserved by the names of the sages as they show up in the Mishnah. Sometimes they were connected to verses in the Torah. and that's why I have it with the pink and the blue lines there. And if you want to know more about this, you can go to the site and you can scroll over the pages, and it tells you all about the different documents of the literature. So I think it's worthwhile for you to explore both of those sites. So this is what we covered last class. Oh, I haven't shared this. Sorry, hold on. What happened? Okay, so this is what we shared, what we went over last class. Everything from creation until the Hasmonean period, which is when the final books of the Bible, specifically the book of Daniel, was produced and was included in the Bible. And we're going to move on from that to saw that live, right? So these are the things that we're looking at today. So the Hellenistic period is when Alexander the Great came, and begins with Alexander the Great conquering most all of the Persian Empire, and also moving into the west all the way into Egypt. And while Jews lived in Alexandria, the city named after Alexander there, and it became the second largest city in the Mediterranean world, the Jews who lived there spoke Greek, and they needed a way to access the Hebrew Bible, but they didn't have as Hebrew with the same facility as people who lived in Judea. So they wrote a translation called the Septuagint.
Yeah.
Next person that we're going to be looking at, and this is the first person that we're going to be looking at, whose text we're going to be looking at, is Ben Sira. And Ben Sira was a scribe. He lived around 200 BCE. He lived in the land of Israel. He wrote a book that is full of wisdom. This book didn't make it into the Bible, and we'll talk about why. Then there's the Hasmonean Revolt, which we are commemorating with the holiday of Hanukkah, and we'll talk about how did that come about and why did it come about. And we're going to look at a guy named Eupolemus, who had a very interesting role in the Hasmonean Revolt, and we'll talk about him as well. The Dead Sea, after a while, the Dead Sea sect emerged. It was also connected to the Hasmonean Revolt because they actually didn't like the Hasmonean Revolt. They didn't like the Hasmoneans, who were priests, but not the right kind of Kohanim. And then about 100 years after the Hasmonean Revolt, Pompey the Great from Rome comes and conquers the entire Roman East down to Egypt, and brings the Jewish people under Roman control. Around that time, a little after Pompey the Great, we see a named scholar that we recognize, maybe because, I don't know, he lived in a Hillel house, or just gave his name to them, but Hillel the Elder, who lived around the transfer from 50 BCE to about 10 BCE. Now, back on the website, I showed you that you could click on the different people. You can also click on the little links inside and show all these things up. I did this because I wanted you to see the pictures of these rabbis, which is kind of cool. But some of the rabbis, which we're not going to actually talk about today, but which emerged in this period, are Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, with whom you may be familiar. He's the one to whom they attribute the birth of the rabbinic movement. His students, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, and his replacement, Rabban Gamliel. Josephus Flavius, who was a Jew from the land of Israel, who was actually a general in the revolt against Rome, but he eventually was taken prisoner by the Romans and wrote in Greek a massive history of the Jews. First, a book called The Jewish War, and then a much larger work called The Antiquities of the Jews. I like to call him Josephus, without whom we know nothing. Rebbe Akiva, who lived after the destruction of the First Temple and the failure of that revolt against Rome, who lived, who was born before the destruction, lived until Second Revolt. The destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Second Revolt against Rome in 132, and that's when Rebbe Akiva was most active. And finally, the publication of the Mishnah, and that's what we're going to be looking at in the last part of today's class. So we'll be looking at the publication of the Mishnah. So these are the things which are all on the Jewish history timeline. If you click on From Genesis, you'll see all of these things, including cute pictures that I extracted from mostly medieval sources of what Rabban Gamliel must have looked like and what Rabbi Yoshua was imagined to look like in these medieval documents. So now we're going to be talking about, as the title, what kinds of books didn't make it, right? We've got our Hebrew Bible, but there were a lot of books that were produced in this period, it just didn't make it. So the first set of books is the Apocrypha. And these are books that were preserved by the Catholic Church as part of their Bible, but weren't part of the Hebrew Bible. And when the Protestant Reformation came about, they said, well, these things aren't in the Hebrew Bible. We're going to not keep them as part of our Bible. We're going to call them Apocrypha. The Catholics call them deuterocanonical. Other books that were produced in this time period were the books of Christian scripture. That is the Gospels, and the four that made it into Christian scripture are only some of the Gospels. There were a lot of other Gospels that were written that didn't make it into their scripture, along with all of the letters that were written from Paul and from Paul's disciples. Books that collectively we call pseudepigrapha. These are books that were written under the name of other biblical characters, as if these biblical characters wrote them or reported them. So we've got the Testament of Levi and the Testament of Abraham. We've got books called Tu Baruch, named after the scribe of Jeremiah. There are books that were by ancient Jews which were preserved by the church, but not part of their Bible, not part of our Bible, including fragments of authors. The person I mentioned earlier, Eupolemus, okay, who was involved in the Hasmonean revolt. Eupolemus was preserved by one of these church fathers who said, oh, I came across this fragment of a book, and he records it in his own book, as well as other multi-volume works by Jews like Philo of Alexandria, who wrote a huge number of volumes of Jewish philosophy in an attempt to try and make Judaism fit within Hellenistic modes of thought, and Josephus, without whom we know nothing. Those were preserved by the church. They're not part of their Bible, but they preserved them. We wouldn't have them if it weren't for the church. And finally, there are discovered books that don't have a continuous history of transmission, but were discovered in modern times, like books that were found in the Cairo Geniza, and more recently than what was found in the Cairo Geniza, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found by a shepherd in the Judean desert, and were produced and copied by the people who lived at the settlement we call Qumran. Here's a little chart just to help you understand what we mean by Apocrypha. And you can see here are the Roman Catholic deuterocanonical books. Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah are additions to the book of Jeremiah, and the prayer of Azariah, Susanna, and Bel and the dragon are all additions to the book of Daniel. And then there's also 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees. And you can see which books made it, all of those made it into what the Protestants call the Apocrypha, along with different versions called 1 Esdras and 2 Esdras, which were also in the Russian Orthodox canon, but not in the Roman Catholic canon. So you can understand we should recognize that these books were preserved. They are part of our heritage in many ways, although the rabbi said, not putting that in the Bible. So we're going to start with this guy, Ben Sira, who's also known as Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes. And it didn't make it into our Tanakh. And that's kind of puzzling. If you take a look at what he says, right? Do not say God is merciful and will wipe out all my sins. Do not expect forgiveness when you sin on top of sin. That should be one, not two. For mercy and anger are with God, and God's displeasure will rest upon the wicked. Now that sounds a lot like the Bible, right? God is both merciful, but also can be angry, right? Rachum v'chanun, right? But at the same time, is capable of taking out punishment. God will visit punishment upon those who sin. That sounds like the Bible. When you compare it to Kohelet, you're kind of surprised. Like, why did this not make it into the Bible, as opposed to Kohelet, which doesn't sound like anything else in the Bible? Why did Kohelet make it in and Ben Sira did not? Any thoughts? Why would a book like this, which is written about the same time as Kohelet, it didn't make it in, Kohelet did?
Kohelet's written by Solomon.
Ah, good. So the easiest answer is that Kohelet is, at least when you read it, it refers to Solomon. I need Kohelet. I'm Kohelet, and I was Melech b'Yerushalayim. I was king in Jerusalem, right? So people say, "Oh, this is Solomon," and it's attributed to Solomon. It doesn't sound like any part of the rest of the Bible, but that's one thing. And Ben Sira was pretty clear that it wasn't, and that's I think the most obvious reason why Ben Sira didn't make it in and Kohelet did. Another possible reason, though, is that this book, which was being debated, was accepted by the church, and it's possible that the rabbi said, we've got enough wisdom books in our Bible, and we don't need to necessarily take on this one, and the church is accepting it, so let's leave it out. But just because a book was rejected from the Bible doesn't mean that it was forgotten, so or that it was ignored. And one of the most beautiful passages in the book of Ben Sira is at the end of the book, where he describes Simon, the son of Yochanan, the Kohen Gadol, in whose generation the house was repaired, and he goes on and on talking about how great Simon, the high priest, was. And this is the period when the high priests were the only people ruling the Jewish people. This is again in year 200 or so. And he says, how glorious was he when he looked forth from the tent and when he went out from the house of the veil, as the morning star from amid thick clouds, and as the full moon in the days of the solemn feast, and as the sun dawning upon the temple of the king, and as a rainbow seen in the cloud. And that poetic theme, which goes on and on for another 30 some odd verses, might sound familiar to you. What if I sing it? Ma nehedar bahashkicho me'ohel uvteto mi beit ha-parochet. I don't remember whether you sing Mar'eh Kohen on the high holidays, on Yom Kippur, but Mar'eh Kohen is clearly directly derived from this. It was clear that the author of that poem, which is not attributed in our Machzorim, we don't know exactly who wrote it. It might have been Yossi ben Yossi, but we don't know, was looking at Ben Sira. The language is the same, right? Even has Kidmu Takeshet Betoche Anan, right? And here it says, Keshet, Yeratab, Anan. It's like he's looking at this, and in the Avoda service, they use this language lifted from Ben Sira. So it didn't make it into our Bible, but it wasn't forgotten. So now we're going to take a look at another book from the Apocrypha, and it's 1 Maccabees. And here we're going to talk a little bit about Hanukkah and its origin. I wanted to start with, in fact, this is the major focus that we're going to look at is why were the Jews Hellenizing? Because you may or may not realize, right? We present Hanukkah as this fight between Judaism and Hellenism, between the Torah true Jews and the Jews who were overly Hellenized. I think we can bring a bit more subtlety to that vision of what was going on with Hanukkah. But I want to take a look at 3 different voices about why Jews were Hellenizing that emerged from 1 and 2 Maccabees. Let's take a look at this first one. At that time, there appeared from among Israel a group of traitors who had no regard for the law and who had a bad influence on many of our people. They said, "Let us make a covenant with the Gentiles, for refusing to associate with them has brought upon us nothing but trouble." And so they built in Jerusalem a gymnasium like those of the Gentiles. They had surgery performed to hide their circumcision, and they abandoned the Holy Covenant and started associating with Gentiles and did all sorts of other evil things. Okay? So why did Jews become traitors? Why did Jews Hellenize according to this?
Well, if they were saying that there were bad influences and it was dangerous to be with the Gentiles, it was a way to be safe.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it to be safe, and let's make a covenant. We're going to make a deal with the Gentiles, right? And this language, covenant, right? He uses the term apotheke in the Greek. I didn't reproduce for you the Greek, but I have it in front of me. But he uses the word apotheke, which is the word that translates brit. They want to make a brit with the Gentiles. A very strange conception of how Jews and non-Jews interact. But it's this idea, I'm a traitor, I'm going to choose to abandon my Judaism, I'm going to make a covenant with the Gentiles, I'm going to hide my circumcision, I'm going to do all those kinds of things. Take a look here now. This is a second voice, and it's also preserved in 1 Maccabees, which was originally written in Hebrew. Okay? Antiochus now issued a law that all nations in his empire should abandon their own customs and become one people. And so all the Gentiles and even many of the people, meaning the Jewish people, followed his law, and they adopted the official pagan religion and offered sacrifice to idols and no longer observed Shabbat. This is a very interesting idea, right? Antiochus is a polytheist. So why would a polytheist want everybody to be all the same, right? In most places, you look at polytheists and they say, oh, they've got their worship, these guys have their worship, and there are all kinds of different gods, and people have their different local worships. Polytheism is, one would assume, kind of pluralistic about that. So why would they say that Antiochus issued a law that everybody had to become one people and do all the same thing? Well, I think part of what went on here is that, I mean, it's not entirely made up. There were aspects of Hellenism that emerged that did become kind of universal, right? The use of Greek, establishment of polis, that is, polises, cities with specific kinds of constitutions. Those were things that did overtake the entire Hellenistic world. But it doesn't make too much sense to me that Antiochus would actually force people to give up their customs and to make one people. So now, Josh, if you can put everybody into, I'm going to share this next source, okay?
All right.
So I'd like you to read this passage, which is a third voice about the origin of Hellenism. This is source sheet number 5. And this is from 2 Maccabees, which was written originally in Greek. That may influence the way you understand this. So I want you, Josh, if you can, break everybody into breakout rooms. And we're going to give you 3 minutes. I want you to choose one person in each breakout room to read the text aloud. And then I want you to talk about, like, why are Jews becoming Hellenized according to 2 Maccabees? And how is the voice of 2 Maccabees different than either the first voice, let's make a covenant with the Gentiles, or the second voice in 1 Maccabees, which is Antiochus is forcing us to become Hellenized. Okay? So is that all? Josh, you can do that for us?
I don't believe so. I think only the host can set breakout rooms. I just sent a message to Rabbi.
I don't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think only Rabbi can set breakout rooms. I just sent him a message.
Oh, okay. Well, then,
Do we? See.
I'm not sure if he's there.
okay. Then if we can't do breakout rooms, then let's just take a look at it together. Okay. Whoops. Sorry.
Button.
Let's take a look at this passage. You read it through on your own.
When we're ready, Rabbi made me host, so I believe I may be able to. Yes, I can set breakout rooms whenever.
We'll try breakout rooms again later. But for right now, what did people find? Why is this? Why, according to 2 Maccabees, were Jews Hellenizing? And how was this voice different than the claim that Jews made a covenant with the non-Jews, or the voice that Jews were that they were forced to do this?
Well, they,
Does anybody want to share?
It's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to get out, do the sports, do all sorts of gymnastics, recreation, than to spend time in a temple or praying and studying and carrying out the rituals of the temple.
So being in the temple is hard. Playing, well, I don't know. If you're actually working really hard at your discus throw, that can be difficult too. But why? So why would they choose the discus throw over learning to sacrifice animals?
Physical enhancement.
Right, good. It makes, right? Good for the body, makes you look good.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're doing this in the gymnasium, what's the origin of the word gymnasium? Anybody? You know the etymology of that word?
No.
It's Greek.
It is Greek. Gymnos means naked.
Yeah, they-
Gymnasia were places where you worked out in the buff.
Yep.
Right? So you want to look good because, like, everybody, you can't hide it behind your sweats, you know,
That's
or
why
your
they
toga,
wanted to keep the
right?
re-
Everybody's going to see you, and you want to look good.
They wanted to reverse the circumcision there.
Which would also explain why they want to reverse their circumcision, because
Right.
people are seeing them good.
See that clearly.
Okay, but it's not just the athletics. And honestly, I mean, we get it. It's not about being forced. It's not about consciously. It's not like they didn't go to the temple, right? As soon as they were done, like they did it as fast as they can. Okay, yes, Yes, Abba, I've learned how to sacrifice a pigeon and a sheep, right? Can I go now? And as soon as he was done, you know, with his pigeon and his sheep, right, off he ran to the gym.
I mean, the Greeks were like the forefront, the dominant culture. This was the way to be modern. This was the way to be
Exactly so. It was cool. It was modern. It was what they wanted. And the decisions to Hellenize were not about, let's make a covenant. The decisions were, do I go to Hebrew school or do I go to soccer practice? And and I think that the fact that 2 Maccabees, which was written in Greek, shows a greater sensitivity to the actual dynamic of assimilation. It wasn't all of a sudden, but it happened fast. I mean, people, just as we can see, like changes in culture happen quite quickly. And they didn't care anything about their ancestors had valued. They cared only about Greek honors. And this happened really fast. And Jews were very engaged. The Greek hat was it's actually a particular kind of hat. And I think it just represents this whole idea of adopting their culture, right? They wanted to, they wore this particular wide brimmed hat. And people, again, they just adopted it. Now I want to point out one thing that you probably skipped over because it didn't look like it was very important. But this one statement about what this guy Jason, who was the high priest, did. He canceled these particular favors that John had secured from previous Syrian kings. And John was the father of a guy named Eupolemus, who later went to Rome to make an alliance and to establish ties of friendship. This is very important. John, in 1 Maccabees, later on in 1 Maccabees, the Judah Maccabee, they're involved in this revolt against the Syrians, and Judah, it says, chose Eupolemus, the son of John and the grandson of Achos, and another guy, Jason, and sent them to Rome to make a treaty of friendship and alliance with the Romans. Right? That's what it says. Make a treaty of friendship and alliance with the Romans. So he did this, and he went to the Roman Senate, which is, you should know, a very pagan place. There's always a sacrifice to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the king of the gods, at the beginning of any session of the Senate. And he said, Judah Maccabee, his brothers and the Jewish people sent us here to make a mutual defense treaty with you so that we may be officially recorded as your friends and allies. And then the narrator says, and the Romans accepted the proposal.
So this was an end run, that the Greeks were then their common enemy, or they sort of.
Right, so Judah did this because this makes great political sense.
Yeah.
Right? You want, if you're fighting against the biggest local power, you want to get somebody who's close but not as close to be your buddy to support you, right? And you can imagine all kinds of ways in which this is like our experience with the Cold War. Countries made alliances with Russia against the United States, or with the United States against Russia. That's what NATO is all about, right? This whole idea of making treaties and treaties of friendship and alliance, where do you get that idea? Which culture was the first one that did that?
Making an alliance?
Yeah, making these kind of political alliances, formal treaties of alliance. Think about the Delian League, okay, or the Athenian League, right? Right? These are things that Greeks came up with. And here you see Judah Maccabee sending one of his own guys off to the Romans to create a treaty of alliance, which is a kind of a Greek thing to do. And he's making a treaty with one pagan against another pagan, right? That's not how Jews are supposed to react. I mean, if you look at the Torah, that's not how Jews are supposed to react to pagans. Jews are not supposed to actually have these kinds of relationships with pagans. But he chose, let's go with the Romans instead of the Greeks. And it's a kind of strange thing. And then let's take a look at this particular guy, Eupolemus. And now we're going to take a look at source sheet number 6. Here I got you the Greek for you. And Eupolemus was actually preserved. We know that he actually wrote in Greek. He lived in Judea. He was a Jew, but he knew Greek well enough to write a book in Greek about the Bible. And he says that Moses was the first wise man, right? That he was a sophon, right? He was like a philosopher. He's the first wise man. And he gave the alphabet to the Jews first, and the Phoenicians received it from the Jews, and the Greeks received it from the Phoenicians. And also Moses was the first to write down laws, and he did so for the Jews. Now, this is stuff that you probably didn't know about because it isn't in our Bible. So is it true? I don't think so. So why would Eupolemus say it? Why would Eupolemus say these things? Yeah, Hammurabi had laws, right? Exactly. Thanks, Steve. Right? Hammurabi. These aren't true statements. I like especially the claim about the alphabet. The Greeks knew where the alphabet came from. The Greeks knew that the alphabet came from the Phoenicians. But since the Phoenicians are right near the Jews, it makes sense from Eupolemus's perspective, right? Oh, well, the Phoenicians must have got it from us. And in fact, he keeps on doing that. So what does he do? He's praising Jews by saying these hallmarks of Greek culture, literacy, laws, right, actually come from the Jews. And he's writing it in Greek. So this is a guy who clearly wants to look good to the Greek culture, to the external Greek culture. He knows that his Jewish friends also want to look good to the outside Greek culture, yet he is not just an ally, he's an emissary from Judah Maccabee. So Judah Maccabee had in his administration this guy who was a writer of Greek, who was significantly Hellenized, who didn't have a problem going to the Roman Senate where they would have a pagan sacrifice, right? Judah sent him there in order to make a treaty. And so I want to point out that the Hasmoneans we shouldn't think of the Hasmoneans as Torah true Jews who fought against Hellenism, but rather the Hasmoneans were themselves quite Hellenized, right? They were friends and associates of the Hasmoneans who wrote in Greek about Jewish history. And Eupolemus made a specific treaty of alliance and friendship with pagans, that is with the Romans, and they established a holiday. Now, this is the coolest part. Do you know how it says that they established the holiday? It says that Judah Maccabee and his brothers brought it before the assembly of the people of Israel, and they unanimously decided to take the 25th day of Kislev as a day that was going to be celebrated with psalms and festivities. What do you call it when an assembly votes and decides on something?
Democracy.
Which is a Greek idea, okay? And this is a huge one. That is, the Hasmoneans adopted democracy, and they did it also for the appointment of Simon as the Kohen Gadol. Simon is the brother of Judah Maccabee, who was also voted on by the assembly, and they said, Simon is going to be the Kohen Gadol until the true prophet comes and tells us otherwise. They know that democracy isn't great. It doesn't always give you the result that you're expecting. Tell me about it. And sometimes it does. And here Simon is elected, but not everybody was happy about it. So here is a quote from my teacher Shaya Cohn, who's now at Harvard. He was my teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And he wrote in an article that he published, the Hasmoneans steered a middle course abjuring the Hellenism of the Hellenizers and the anti-Hellenism of the Qumranites, who we'll talk about in a moment. Their goal was to find a way to live with Hellenism, to combine a secure Jewish identity with Hellenistic cultures. The Hasmoneans did not save Judaism from Hellenism so much as they showed the Jews how to live with it. I find this a brilliant and really powerful way of thinking about the Hasmonean revolt, and even more a way of thinking about Hanukkah. Because this is a message about Hanukkah, an almost miraculous thing to me, that Jews were willing to fight a war, not against the wicked, Greeks, but against these people for whom their opposition was more subtle. And most of the time when we go to war, we have to see things in black and white. And we really describe them that way. And for the Maccabees and for the Hasmoneans in general, it was a much more subtle thing. We're not going to say reject all of Hellenistic culture. We're not going to say adopt all of Hellenistic culture. We don't want you to give up circumcision. We don't want you to give up working in the temple. Instead, we want you to adopt certain things, pick out the good stuff, and leave the bad stuff. And know where your priorities are. And that, I think, is a very subtle idea, a difficult one to motivate people to go to war for, but they did. That's the miracle that I lit for this evening. So I mentioned the Qumran folk, and they were not particularly happy. In fact, this is the origin of the Dead Sea sect, at least I think so, and most scholars do, but some don't. There are people who disagree about everything, but most scholars think that somehow in the Hasmonean period, this is the people who ran off to the Dead Sea were people who were actually from the right priestly family. And when Simon was elected to be the high priest, that caused all kinds of problems. And here's a story about how the wicked priest, by which they mean whichever of the descendants of Simon, John Hyrcanus probably, came out to the Qumran settlement and pursued the teacher of righteousness with his anger and his fury. And on the Day of Atonement, he appeared before them to confuse them and to cause them to stumble on the day of fasting, their Sabbath of repose. That is, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, who was the person who was in charge of the government, comes out to Qumran on Yom Kippur and yells at the teacher of righteousness, who was the head of the Qumran community. Now, he gets this from an interesting reading of the book of Habakkuk, which is for this Qumran community. They were reading the book of Habakkuk, which was written in 612 BCE. And they said, it's not talking about 500 years ago, it's talking about now. And that's what this Pesher literature is all about. It's kind of a midrash, which is where it's the kind of stuff that you would see on late night TV, where you've got Christian televangelists reading the book of Daniel and saying, and this is what's happening right now. This is what was going on in Qumran. But the story is kind of strange here. How is it that the Kohen Gadol could go out to Qumran on Yom Kippur? Isn't the Kohen Gadol kind of busy on Yom Kippur?
I was thinking about that.
It's like it's his big day, right? So he has nothing better to do on Yom Kippur than to show up out in Qumran? And the only way to make sense of this is to look at other aspects of the literature from Qumran, and you can see the people in Qumran were using a totally different calendar. And so their Yom Kippur was not the same as the Yom Kippur that was being observed in Jerusalem. And that's what makes these people, this sect of people who live out at the Dead Sea, really quite different Not only did they have their own literature, books that they considered holy and sacred, teachers who they considered authoritative other than everybody else, but at the same time, they lived their life differently. They had different purity laws, they had all, and a different calendar. And this caused a huge split, and these people never made it back into the Jewish community. And you'll see they were pretty much, they lived out at the Dead Sea until they were wiped out by the Romans, who were busy in the Dead Sea area around the year 73 with this mountain retreat called Masada. Now I want to talk about Christianity. Yet another set of books that didn't make it into our Bible. And how did the Jews think about the Christians? And I'm not actually bringing a particular text from the Christian Bible, but I do want to talk about different ways in which we can understand the relationship between Christianity and Judaism that emerges in this period after the destruction of the Second Temple, and how does it emerge? So from a rabbinic perspective, there have always been groups that broke off, right? The northern kingdom broke off from the southern kingdom of Judah. The Samaritans, which is a group that were around the Har Gerizim and Har Eval, they split off. There were these Hellenizing Jews that went too far. The Essenes and the Sadducees, other groups that broke off. The Christians were just like them. Later on, the Karaites, and later on, even more later, the Sabbateans. The only difference is the Christians continued. There was a question I saw about Ben Sira as being the basis of the Amida. That I don't think. I think it reflects the same thing. There's a variety of aspects, and I would encourage you to take a look for an article. I think it's available online by Tzvi Zahavi, who talks about priestly influences and patriarchal influences, that is the Nasi, the house of the Nasi, and their impact on the Amida. That there were larger prayers, that there were series of prayers in Ben Sira and later on. Just, I look at it as somebody looked at this text and said, oh, right, scholars will look at Ben Sira and say, oh, this is similar. But I don't see enough of a similarity to say that the rabbis were looking at it as a basis. But in any case, this is one model, right? Christians are a sect just like these other sects. The only problem is they continued. The other ones didn't. From Christian perspective, right, there's Israelite religion, and then along comes Jesus, whom they see as the Christ, which is the Messiah. And what ends up happening is, at that point, Christianity becomes the true Israel. It's the Israel according to the Spirit. Now, there are other Christian heresies that split off, and there are Jews that reject Christianity. And then there are Judaizing Christians, that is, Christians who think that you have to observe the law. And so they effectively, from the perspective of the church, are basically Jews. But ultimately, they believe that these Jews, whether they were Jews, people, biological descendants of Israel, or Judaizing Christians, that is, people who were Christians and then kind of became Jewish-like, all of them are ultimately, in the end time, going to adopt Christianity. This is, there was a movie at the Other Jewish Film Festival about evangelical support for Israel. This is what that's all about. It is the end time coming and Jews rejoining Christianity as part of the second coming. Romans didn't see Christianity that way. There's Judaism, it was ancient. There's Christianity, it was modern, and they didn't see them as related or connected really at all. And here's a contemporary view, and I think this is the view that was popularized by my teacher, Alan Siegel, who said, look, you've got Israelite religion, and from Israelite religion, you've got two different major groups that broke off of it. Rabbinic Judaism, which is not the same thing as the religion of the Bible, is not Israelite religion, and Christianity. And they both go back to Israelite religion. They just focus on different things. So if you look at Christianity, Christianity focuses on the book of Leviticus. It focuses on the idea of sacrifice. God offered up his own son as sacrifice. It was the perfect sacrifice. It atoned for everybody's sins. And therefore, they've got priests, which are described in the book of Leviticus, and focus on the Eucharist and the sacred meal. All of that is out of Leviticus. Christianity focuses on that. Rabbinic Judaism, on the other hand, focuses more on Exodus and on Deuteronomy, on the sources of law, and creating a sanctified life through that. But we don't do as much with Leviticus. And that creates a kind of tension, because both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity emerge both preserving this Bible, but we each have our own separate books that we think of as really important. For Rabbinic Judaism, it becomes the Mishnah. For Christianity, it becomes Christian scripture, what they call the New Testament. This model, Alan Siegel describes in his book, Rebecca's Children, because Jews traditionally think of the Jews as Yaakov and the Christians as Esau. Yeah, so the question that was asked about Christian Jews versus Jewish Christians, right? So there are, I think the best way of looking at it is Christian Jews are Jews who adopted Christianity. And all of the earliest Christians were Christian Jews. That is, they adopted Christianity as their form of Judaism. Jewish Christians, I think, is more about the Gentiles who adopted Christianity and then thought that they needed to Judaize. That is, in order to really accept Christianity, they had to become part of Judaism. And I think that's, again, that there's no evidence that Gentile Christians, that is, people who were born Gentile, were ever accepted amongst Rabbinic Jews. But people who were born Jews who accepted Christianity, it's not clear when they split off, at what point they split off. And Daniel Boyarin, great scholar, doesn't think it happened finally until the 4th century. My teacher Shaya Cohn thinks it happens in the 2nd century. I'm actually closer to Boyarin on that point. I want to just briefly refer to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, which was this massive, huge event. Really took, it was a really, really significant event. The temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish life. And when it was destroyed, there is a real question, is Judaism going to continue? Fortunately, we had different models of people who had lived in other ways. Some people thought Judaism was over, and this book from the pseudepigrapha, book called Tu Baruch, shows exactly how grief-stricken Jews were. Blessed is he who was not born, because we've seen that which has befallen Jerusalem. And vine, why do you still give your wine? Because we can't use you to give up wine offerings. And you wives, do not pray to bear children, because you don't want to have children. Priests, take the keys of the sanctuary and cast them up to God and say, you guard the house, because we have been found to be false stewards. That is this conception that life is pretty much over with the destruction of the Second Temple. And what ends up happening is that Jews create, we're going to get to that. But yes, the Jews end up creating a new model of how to respond to that kind of destruction. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the Torah, and then we have halakha emerging from at least the last 4 books of the Torah. And then some of that gets selected and put into the book called the Mishnah. That brings us up to the year 220 or so. But there's all this other halakha that didn't make it into the Mishnah. And some of that was collected a little bit later and put into a book on the same structure as the Mishnah, and that book was called the Tosefta. The next text we're going to look at is actually from the Tosefta, and it responds directly to that story that we just looked at. The Mishnah, in here it's a Tosefta, but you can take a look at what happens here, and this is source sheet number 9. After the temple was destroyed, there were people who would not eat meat and who wouldn't drink wine. And Rabbi Yehoshua dealt with them, saying, "My children, why don't you eat meat?" And they say, "Should we eat meat? We can no longer offer up sacrifices." He said, "And why don't you drink wine? Should we drink wine, which they used to pour liquid offerings on the altar, and now we can't?" He said, "Well, then you shouldn't eat bread, because we used to put up the 2 loaves of the showbread, and you can't drink water because we used it for a liquid offering on Sukkot, and you can't eat figs or grapes either because they were brought as offerings on Shavuot. So what are you going to do?" And they were silent. And then he said, "Not to mourn at all is impossible, but to mourn too much is also impossible. So what should a person do? The sages say you should plaster your entire house, but leave a small part unplastered as a memorial to Jerusalem." If you go to Israel, you can see from people's houses, you'll see that they leave a corner unplastered. Or a woman should put on all her adornments, but leave one part unadorned, right? The origin of wearing only one earring, I guess, right? And the idea here is that the rabbis said, you got to mourn, but you can't mourn too much. You have to create a world that you can live in. So we're going to conclude with this last text. This is a tough text, but it is a really important one. And this is, I think, the brilliant feature of the Mishnah as a response to the kinds of conflicts that we saw in Second Temple Judaism, right, where the high priest came and was yelling at the teacher of righteousness, and they had different days for Yom Kippur. This is really seriously problematic. Okay, so in order to understand this, you have to think about a mikvah. Okay, I'm going to come back to this text in a second, but I'm just going to a mikvah. Actually, I'll just explain. A mikvah is a body of water. If you become impure by contact with a dead body, or any other reason, a woman after her menstrual cycle is over, become impure, the way the rabbi said you get rid of that impurity is by immersing in a mikvah. A mikvah has a specific volume. It's about 40 seah, which just imagine it's like 60 gallons or so. It's big, okay? And you have to immerse in this mikvah, right? That's the smallest size. Ours are much bigger. The water in a mikvah has to be undrawn water. That's why they create these big systems where water flows in, but isn't being drawn by a bucket or by pipes or anything like that. Water just flows in. Nowadays, we create these big tanks of water that flows in, and then we connect those big tanks with the water that gets circulated through and replaced. And this idea of having these huge tanks, but on the other hand, this water that you can connect or not connect is connected particularly to this Mishnah. Because if you imagine in the land of Israel, right, you got water coming in, it's very hard to deal with that in a hot place where you don't have control over evaporation and stuff like that. So the water will evaporate slowly. So what if it doesn't rain and the water is evaporated a bit and you need to go to the mikvah? And there's no longer enough water because the water's evaporated. What do you do? basically what the rabbis say is you're allowed to top it off. You can use a pitcher, add in water just enough to top it off. Okay? So all of the water is water that flowed directly, but some of the water at the very, you can pop it off. That's all. And this Mishnah discusses that. Now, we're going to find out is that this particular issue is not really the important issue, but you have to understand it in order to understand what's going on. So let's take a look at this. And would somebody like to read this passage for us? Starting with Hillel says. Miriam, would you like to read for us?
Hillel says, a hint, full of drawn water renders the mikvah unfit. However, one must speak in the language of his teacher. And Shammai says, 9 caps, I don't know, clubs, okay. And the sages say, neither according to the opinion of the one, nor according to the opinion of the other, until 2 weavers from the Dunk Gate, which is in Jerusalem, came and identified in the name of Shemaiah and Abtalion, 3 logs of drawn water rendered the mikvah unfit. The sages confirmed that statement. I don't know what it means.
What is the weirdest thing about this? And scientists, people who work in the sciences, you should be flipping out at this text. What is the weirdest thing about this Mishnah?
That it's never fit. It's never right, no matter what.
Well, they ultimately, the sages say, no, 3 logs of drawn water, that's the amount that you're allowed to top off. More than, if it gets below 3, to add more than 3 logs of water, you can't top it off, you have to wait for rain. Well, what's the problem with this?
Where do the weavers come in?
Well, they're the ones, okay, so here you see Hillel says his opinion, Shammai says his opinion, but these 2 weavers come and they testify in the name of their teachers, Shemaiah and Avtalion, this. So what you have here is a conflict between people who have opinions and people who have tradition. So the 2 weavers, their opinion is accepted apparently because they've got a tradition that they learned from their teachers, Shemaiah and Avtalion. And their tradition trumps, even though they're weavers from the dung gate, their tradition trumps the opinions, the statements without a tradition of Hillel and Shammai, who were just basically saying, well, this is what I think. But that's not the weirdest thing about this. What is the weirdest thing about reading this Mishnah? Come on, scientists, you have to, there must be people who are like, who have science exposure. There's something just incredibly strange with this. What is making you a hard time understanding this thing? Why do they have different terms of measurement? Why didn't they just edit it so that they were all talking about the same number of hin, or the same number of kav, or the same number of log? Right? And they say, oh, well, a person has to speak in the language of his teacher. So since Hillel gave his opinion in hin, and Shammai gave his opinion in kavin, you actually have to say that. Now, it doesn't change the meaning if you change the units of measurement, right? But they felt, got to say it exactly as they said it. That was the degree to which they're trying to emphasize the traditionality of this. Now let me take a look. Let's take a look here at a chart that explains it, right? So a hin is equal to 3 kav, which is equal to 12 log, which is equal to half of a seah. Okay? And if you wanted to simply do it, you could have just put it in login. It would have been very simple. And they could have said, Hillel says 12 login, Shammai says 36 login, the weavers say 3 login. Okay? And here you can see graphically how much that gives you. You're allowed to top off the water, right? So here This is Hillel's opinion. This is Shammai's opinion, which is actually more lenient, kind of interesting. And here is the opinion of Shmaya and of Talion as reported by the Weavers. Okay? So they could have done that, but they didn't because they wanted to preserve the language to talk about their traditionality. But they preserve the opinion of Shmaya and of Talion because it's a tradition. So the Mishnah then continues, and it says, why do they record the opinions of Shammai and Hillel for no purpose? That is, they aren't following Shammai and Hillel, right? They just were giving us their opinions. When Shmaya and Talion, we have a tradition going back. Why didn't we do that? And this is the point behind why they quote this dispute. To teach the following generations that a man should not always persist in his opinion. Behold, the fathers of the world did not persist in their opinion. That is, don't be stubborn. Don't stand on your ego, right? You can imagine Hillel and Shammai saying, who are these weavers from the dung gate? We should listen to them? Well, yes. When you're faced with a tradition, you listen to the tradition, or don't get your ego involved. You should listen to other people, and you may be wrong, and you may be trumped. You may have your vote. They may decide to vote against you. And no, how are they determining law? We'll take a look at the next Mishnah. Why do they record the opinion of an individual with the majority when the halakha must be according to the opinion of the majority? What are they doing to establish the law in the Mishnah? It's voting. It's democracy. In action, just like the Hasmoneans established. If it weren't for the Hasmoneans who adopted democracy into Judaism in the year 165 BCE, Judaism would not be the same as it is. It would not have developed the way it did. If the rabbis adopted this idea of voting from what became just culturally the right way to determine something. But the question is, why did they record the opinion of an individual when the majority is all that matters in halakha? So they've now extrapolated to a much larger case. Before they said Hillel and Shammai, they were individuals. They listened to the opinion of Shmaya and of Talion as reported by the Weavers. Okay.
Well, it adds legitimacy to the decisions.
How does having the minority opinion give you legitimacy? That's a great comment. Why do you think that's the case?
Because you can argue against it or you can argue with it. And that argument then in and of itself gives the whole process a sense of legitimacy. Certainly something we're seeing now.
So having minority voice there preserving the idea that this was not just like somebody just said this, but rather there was a discussion. We had a discussion. We voted, we came to a conclusion. This is the majority position. That's the other opinion that we've rejected.
Supreme Court.
Yeah,
we publish the minority decisions because it's important. You get a greater sense of what's going into the majority opinion, looking at the minority opinion. Great. Any other ideas?
Well, that's to show that other points of view are considered in the course of deliberation and reaching a conclusion.
Really important. These are all really important possibilities. Let's take a look and see how this Mishnah continues. Right? If you're following along inside the text from Safaria, right? Don't go ahead too fast. Right? The first claim is so that if a court prefers the opinion of the individual, it may depend on him as a precedent. Meaning, if a later court, looking at the majority opinion and the minority opinion, says, we actually like the minority opinion, we can join and we can say that the law is according to the minority opinion. That is, on the authority of the later court, they are able to look at the minority opinion and base the law on the minority opinion as a precedent. Now, that's a really powerful claim. The minority opinion then is not rejected because it's wrong. It's rejected because the majority didn't vote for it. It could also be true. It could also be the halakha.
Preserved.
And that's why it's preserved. Now, it goes a little bit further. For no court may set aside the decision of another court that is greater than it in wisdom and in number. That is, if I've got a court of 23 and you were a court of 3, my court of 23, which was like this intermediate size, or a court of 70, the Sanhedrin, larger court, it can overturn the opinion of an earlier court that decided something because I'm larger. That is, as long as I'm smarter. I have to be greater than that previous court, both in wisdom and in number. If I'm not greater in wisdom, if I'm greater in wisdom but not in number, or because I'm like the same size, but even if I'm smarter, if I'm the same size, I can't just overturn them. If I'm greater in number, but we're just not as smart as they were back then, also I can't overturn that position. But if I'm greater in number, it is I've got a Sanhedrin, a court of 70, and that decision was made by a court of 3, I can overturn it. That's the general rule. But if there's a minority opinion, I don't need to be greater in wisdom and number. If there's a minority opinion, I can rely on the minority opinion, and that minority gets pushed into my court, and all of a sudden, I'm a new majority. So the minority opinion is there because it does reflect a possible truth. It can become the law. And this is an amazing claim. And the Mishnah makes that claim. Now, you should know that it's not the only voice on this issue. Rabbi Yehuda asks the same question, right? That previous opinion was stated without any named rabbi, but they asked the same question. If so, why do they record the opinion of an individual alongside the opinion of the majority? And he says, to annul it. So that if a man shall say, thus have I learned the tradition, it may be said to him, according to the refuted opinion of this particular individual, did you hear it? That is, here's the Mishnah. It includes the majority opinion and the minority opinion. He says, I heard that the law was that we recite, 18 blessings, and you're telling me that we actually recite 19 blessings, even though it's called the Shemona Esrei? I don't get it. He said, well, that's true, but that opinion was rejected. We recite 19 blessings, even though we call it Shemona Esrei, even though we call it the 18. Okay? You did hear something, right? So you can imagine, right, that allows the person who heard that other tradition to say, oh, yeah, I get it. Okay, so I didn't make it up. I'm not a failure. I'm not just making things up or misremembering. I actually did learn that. But you're telling me that it's not the law because we decided the law differently. I get it. Now, this is very interesting. We've got 2 different possible approaches. Why do we include the minority opinion? One is that we include the minority opinion in order to base later law on it. That is, a later court can come along and say, minority opinion, I agree with that one. Actually, we're going to overturn. And the other approach of Rabbi Yehuda is, no, minority opinion, it's there, so we should say nobody should ever think that this is the law because we actually recorded it, and you should know that this guy, he said it, but he was voted down. Now, you may have noticed something else that's kind of interesting about this text. And in order to explain this, I got to tell you something about the formal aspects of the Mishnah. The first is the Mishnayot, that is, individual paragraphs in the Mishnah, frequently preserve disputes. Some of those disputes include 2 or 3 named sages. Most of the time, one of the voices in the dispute is either stated as the sages say, or these are the words of the sages, or the opinion is simply anonymous. Those opinions, the ones that are either attributed to the sages or are anonymous, are considered the majority opinion. And so you'll have the majority opinion as opposed to the opinion of one or maybe two other named sages who are the minority opinions. So if you think about it, when does the Mishnah record a sage's name?
When it's a minority.
Yeah. Your name is preserved in the Mishnah. Remember, this was oral literature. Right? This is the oral book. This was an oral literature. People had to spend time to memorize these texts. And when did you hear about somebody? You only heard about them when they were dissenting from the majority. When they disagreed. Now, if you think about the Second Temple period, when people disagreed, what did they do? They went off to Qumran. Or they became overly Hellenized. Or they created a whole other religion, like Christianity. When they disagreed, their conception of truth and law was such that they said, we can't live with each other. What the rabbis came up with, and this is the huge, the beauty of what happened in the context of the destruction of the temple, was that the rabbis said, we're going to make it so the person who disagrees stays at the table. And we're going to do that by giving them kavod, by giving them honor. You're in the majority all the time, we're never going to know your name. But when you disagree, we're going to record your name. So that even though you may not be the law may not be according to you right now, you should know eventually the law could become like you. Eventually, a later court might say, oh, you know that opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, that sounds good to us. We're going to follow Rabbi Eliezer, or we're going to follow Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to follow Rabbi Shimon. That's a better idea. And so you can sit at the table and say, okay, right now I lost, but later on I might win. And people, even if I never become the halacha, people are going to learn about my position. And they're going to learn my name because that's how the Mishnah is written. They're going to know my name. They're going to know my ideas. So ultimately, I want to just go back and contrast these two, right? Mishnah Eduyot has two different responses to the question of why does a minority opinion show up with the majority, even though the halakha is always according to the majority. Now, what do you notice about these two Mishnayot? The question is basically the same. What's different about them?
One is the anonymous voice asking it, and one is an individual asking.
Yeah. So this is the majority opinion, and this is the minority opinion. So the majority opinion then is you can use a minority opinion as a precedent. The minority opinion is that a minority opinion is rejected. So a later court can say, I'm going to follow this majority opinion. Or it can say, I think I need to follow the minority opinion because things have changed. Times have changed, and the needs of the community require me to go according to the minority opinion. But what if somebody says, we think we should follow the minority opinion, and you don't think this is a good idea? Somebody says, isn't there an opinion? Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that you can have milk and chicken together. Don't you think that this is a good idea? Shouldn't we do this? And you can say, No,
You have to be
actually,
greater in
Rabbi Yossi
wisdom and in
Aglili, we
number.
know about his opinion, and that's a reasonable opinion. You should know it was recorded, but that opinion was decided on and voted against. That is, the later rabbi can either rely on the minority opinion and make later halacha on it, or the later rabbi can look at the minority opinion and say, you know, we voted on it and that's decided. We're not going to go that way. So this way, the Mishnah is set up actually gives the later rabbi a tremendous amount of flexibility. They will learn both opinions and they can say, I'm either going to take the minority opinion or I can tell somebody who knows about the minority opinion, and I don't think it's a good idea, no, we voted on it and it's out. Because he can rely on the minority opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that says we can exclude the minority opinion sometimes.
I think it goes.
Right? So the anonymous opinion says minority opinions can be precedents, and Rabbi Yehuda says minority opinions are recorded so that they can be identified as rejected opinions. And we should know that the Mishnah did that in order to create this culture of keeping people at the table, giving rabbis a great degree of flexibility. So let's think about what we learned so far about the books that didn't make it and the oral book that is the Mishnah that did. So when we looked at the Tanakh, right? When we looked at the Tanakh, it's inclusive of difference. It's a symphony. It sometimes includes discordant voices, like Kohelet. When we look at some books that maybe fit more closely with the themes of the Tanakh, like Ben Sira, they didn't make it. Why? They had their reasons. It's not obvious. It doesn't mean that these books from the Second Temple period are books that we necessarily should reject, or that not making it into the canon was lousy. It means that it's bad or heretical, or as the general term for it, the Sfarim Gnuzim, these hidden away books. It doesn't necessarily mean that. And sometimes we preserve them. The Hasmonean revolt provides a window on how Jews dealt with Hellenism. And the Hasmonean response to Hellenism was not acceptable to everybody. Their response was, we can adopt certain aspects of Hellenism, including democracy of a sort, but we don't have to accept every aspect of Hellenism. And the Hasmonean response was not acceptable to everybody, but people who wanted to Hellenize, more, and people like the Qumran sect who rejected even the moderate Hellenism of the Hasmoneans. The destruction of the temple was a major rupture in Jewish culture and society. And there were a variety of different kinds of responses to the temple, even while it stood. And the response of the Pharisees, which you haven't mentioned, but the response of the Pharisees was a fairly successful model. But my model is actually I like to use a model of a polyculture. There was a diversity of responses in the Second Temple period. And when a huge cataclysm happened, it was because we had a variety of different responses that one of them basically succeeded. If we'd had a monoculture, it wouldn't have worked. The Mishnah largely responds to the destruction of the temple by ignoring it. It pretends as if the temple is already around, is still around, or that as if the world, everybody knows about the temple and it's still in existence. It just ignores it. And then it responds to the second divisions of the Second Temple period by creating an inclusive model of conversational Torah that kept disagreements from becoming divisive. It allowed for people to stay at the table. And that is, I think, the particular brilliance of the Mishnah and why it became the document that is our second scripture. So there you have it. We've gotten now up to the year 220, we've seen how the Tanakh incorporates all of these different voices and how the Mishnah does it in a very different way, but is also about being inclusive of these different voices. This is not the same thing as what I would call pluralism. That doesn't emerge, I think, until the end of the Talmudic period. So next class, we're going to be looking at a couple of examples from the Talmudic period where we can see how does the Babylonian Talmud specifically transform Judaism. We're going to look at some other literatures that emerge, and we're going to be looking at a particular thesis which I find really compelling. It's got a bunch of problems in its details, but in an overarching view, it's, I think, brilliant. And that is the thesis of Victor Eckstein and Maristella Botticini. And it's a book called The Chosen Few. It made huge impacts a few years back when it was published. There are all kinds of podcasts where people were interviewing the either Eckstein or Botticini talking about this. It's a really worthwhile piece of literature, and we're going to talk about a piece of historical scholarship, and it comes from an economics perspective. Victor Eckstein was the chief economist of the Bank of Israel. He's also a scholar of Talmud. And I think it is worthwhile looking at the Talmud and why the Talmud won in light of this particular hypothesis, and it has a lot to do with Jewish education in our particular book culture and our focus on literacy. So there was one other question that was in the chat that I missed. Good comment, Steve, about the general, right, that we've got principles that have exceptions. In any case, if there are other questions, please share them, and let's try and clear things up. Yeah, Jonathan. This is not Jonathan.
Yeah, not to make it a we versus they, but the roots of democracy in Judaism, not only from the Greeks, but doesn't go back to Torah. I think of all the egalitarianism. Everybody contributes a shekel to the Mishkan. Sacrifice, the only Near Eastern culture where everybody participates in the sacrifice, not just the priest or the high priest. That kind of egalitarianism, or do you distinguish that from democracy?
I would say that that's probably why the Hasmoneans looked at that particular the Hellenistic culture of democracy and were amenable to it. That is, they looked at it and they said, everybody should have a voice. That kind of makes sense, right? Because we believe in Selam Elokim, we believe in everybody being involved. Why shouldn't we take this on, right? I don't think that. I mean, the Torah, as we saw significantly last class, is a document of tremendous politics, and the politics that emerge, the final voice in putting together the Torah, is the voice of the high priests, who really do have all the power. And as you can see with Ben Sira, right, the high priest is the God. How glorious is he, right? They really do have all the power. But when the Hasmoneans were confronting this popular and thoughtful idea in Hellenistic culture, they bought it. And it was a way for them to create a holiday, a military holiday. And Jews didn't create holidays celebrating military victories. Greeks did that. Right? There's a big, huge holiday over the victory at the Battle of Salamis. Right? Like, there are these big Greek military holidays. That's what Hanukkah was for them. But they established it because it wasn't traditional. Steve, you had another question.
I was going to say, I don't think we should make too much of the parallels between the Talmudic tradition and true democracy, because in the Talmudic tradition, we follow the majority of people who are qualified to have an opinion, and that's a very, very high bar. Unless you have some very high level of study, your opinion does not count. And we have stories in the Mishnah Talmud about contention over who is entitled to have a vote and who is not entitled to have a vote. I remember the conflict between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and I think it's Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is the one who gets promoted, where they're debating whether people are educated enough for their opinion to matter versus purging the voter rolls, basically, is what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel wants to do.
Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, but yeah. And I
it's
see
not,
it as a step
I mean, it's
along
also
the way.
not, also in Greek democracy, there was a very high barrier to being deemed a citizen and able to vote. But it's different from what we have in the United States, where every member of the body politic comes with a right to participate in the democracy unless disqualified for some reason. In both the Greek and the Mishnaic model, you have to prove yourself worthy of a vote before you get one.
I definitely agree with what you just argued. I would take it one step. I would draw one other aspect to it. The opinion in the time of 1 Maccabees was they had to say this was unanimous, right? It was as if it wasn't authoritative unless it was unanimous. We know it wasn't unanimous, right? We know the entire community of the people at the Dead Sea, they would not have voted for Simon to be the Kohen Gadol, right? Maybe they were all unanimous over establishing Hanukkah. That was kind of cool. We got the temple back, and we're going to sing psalms. Like, who's going to be against Hanukkah? That's kind of cool. But appointing Simon, somebody from the wrong house, to be the Kohen Gadol, that's problematic. And we know that they didn't agree. But 1 Maccabees, when it records, it only says it's authoritative because it's unanimous. The rabbis, on the other hand, have made a step along the way. Right? It doesn't have to be unanimous. It can be just a majority. And there's going to be people who are going to lose in the vote. And that's another step along the way. And then a much later step is that that we find wisdom in the broad set of voices, the broadest set of voices, without qualifications. But even in this country, like we had poll taxes and we had all kinds of ways in which people's right to vote they were disqualified, even in the last election, and people trying to disqualify other people's votes, right? We do that, okay? I think we should recognize the inadequacies of our own conceptions of democracy and our own experience of democracy, and not hold it up. I mean, ideally, we've got a much better system, and in general, it's certainly a much more advanced conception of democracy than what the Mishnah had. But the Mishnah had made a significant advance over what the Hasmoneans had, which was, again, a big difference than saying the only authoritative voice is the voice that is conveyed in Scripture. And which actually makes me a point that I didn't make, but is worthwhile making, which why did they have all these pseudepigrapha? Why did people have to say, oh, I'm writing this thing, I'm writing it, but I can't say it in my own name. I have to say that this was Baruch who wrote it, or this was Abraham who wrote it, or this was Levi who wrote it. That's because they didn't say, there wasn't any kind of personal authority. They couldn't say, oh, I'm just this guy, right? I want to claim the authority of this great ancestor. I'm going to write it as a pseudepigrapha, named in this guy. Right? That's a very different claim than saying Rabbi Akiva said, Rabbi Eliezer said. Okay, those are very different kinds of claims. Okay, so I want to wish you a Chag Urim Sameach. Remember about the miracle of fighting for a subtle reason. I think that's a really powerful reason to light our Hanukkah candles. And I wish you all a beautiful Chag Urim Sameach. I'm really, really taken with your beautiful new Chanukiah, rainbow-colored Chanukiah. It's remarkably beautiful and very well done. I don't know who painted it and whatever, but very impressed. And I wish you
a group put that together.
Just remarkably beautiful. distinct. I think it would be really cool actually if you made like small ones, like that one with the rainbow, and produced them and sold them at the Carrot Festival. I would order one along with my carrot cake. Anyway, and I've got piles of Chanukiot. I'd still get a new one. Anyway, I wish you all a Chag Urim Sameach and a Shabbat Shalom, and have a very good.
Thank you for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Yasher Koach.
Bruchatzi.